Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this press conference in which parliamentarians will speak, excuse me, to the urgent need for an inquiry into the use by law enforcement of what are called wellness checks. My name is Elizabeth May. I'm parliamentary leader for the Green Party of Canada. I'm joined this morning by Senator Kim Pate, and here in the capacity, I suppose we'd say, of moral support, Senator Pao Wu from the Independent Senate Group. As well, we have been in consultations and have support from the New Democratic member for Courtenay-Alberni, Gord Johns. Suite à une vague de décès dans tout le Canada aux mains des forces de l'ordre dans le cadre des contrôles de bien-être des parlementaires, aujourd'hui, nous annonçons qu'une enquête sera menée au Sénat. We have been, I personally am involved through the direct request of the president of the New Chalmouth Tribal Council, Judith Sayers, who has already met with the Minister for Public Safety, Bill Blair, in requesting urgently a task force into the question of wellness checks causing death. In that conversation, Minister Blair indicated that there weren't resources for that at the moment. And when the president of the Tribal Council came to me, I reached out to my friend Kim Pate. I'm going to turn it over to Senator Kim Pate to describe why she believes that we can move forward in the Senate once the Senate recess ends in September. Over to you, Senator Pate.
Thank you, Ms. May. It's my privilege and responsibility to come to you from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg. And it's the horrendous intersection of the pandemic of racism and the health pandemic that we're facing now, which gives rise to the call that Ms. May and others have raised in this country. For far too long, we have eviscerated, cut short the supports, the health care, the social service, the mental health in particular care, and the supports that are available to people who are most marginalized in this country, particularly Indigenous people. It behooves us to look at why we have increasingly abandoned those who are most vulnerable to the streets, to the jails, or to death. Police are often the last ones called because we have no other services available in the community. That is a travesty of which not just me, but many other senators, many other members of parliament are concerned, many Canadians, and certainly the families of those who have died at the hands of the police as well as the prison system in this country. And so I join Ms. May and other parliamentarians in calling immediately for a release of a fulsome investigation into this death, the death of Chantal Moore, but also the death of many others, the deaths of many others, and a quick and a vital decision by the federal government about how we will implement meaningful, transparent, effective oversight of policing and corrections in this country. Now, the police and corrections don't decide who comes to them. And so the other piece we need to be looking at is why we have allowed ourselves to end up in a situation where more and more people are more and more desperate in this country. Why we have allowed violence to not be taken seriously against children, against women, so that when they anesthetize themselves with drug or alcohol in order to negotiate the poverty, the trauma that they've experienced, when they develop mental health issues as part of the coping involved in that past trauma, why we then, instead of providing supports, underprotect people and over-police and incarcerate them. That is part of what we need to look at. The Senate's currently in recess, but the Senate committees do have the powers to conduct the sorts of inquiries that Ms. May and others are calling for. My hope is that we won't need that action will be taken long before this happens in September. But if it is not, my hope is that my Senate colleagues will join us in ensuring that we have a fulsome discussion of this, not to just have another report, but to actually see action. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. And thank you, Ms. May, for organizing this.
Thank you. I think in order for this press conference to have logistical coherence, I'm going to now turn to the telephone and explain that these tragedies, of course, are across Canada, and fortunately, I'm a leader for a parliamentary caucus that includes Jenica Atwin, who's the Member of Parliament for Fredericton. Two of the tragic deaths of Indigenous people in wellness checks in the month of June occurred in New Brunswick. I know that Jenica Atwin wants to speak to this issue, and we have her on the line from her riding in New Brunswick. If we can go to Jenica, and then I'll have a closing statement.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. Bonjour tout le monde et merci pour inclure cette discussion aujourd'hui. I am here in Fredericton in the unceded territories of Wolastoq-Gowiak, and it's an honor for me to participate in this very important press conference this morning because this is an issue that's close to my heart for so many different reasons. I am the Green Party critic for diversity and inclusion. I am the Green Party critic for women and gender equality, for Indigenous services. So it intersects on so many levels, for health as well. So for me, also as a New Brunswicker, I want answers for families. I want a clear path forward. I want us to comb through the systemic issues that we have in multiple institutions, but particularly because it's so important at this moment to look into our policing institutions and how we respond to wellness checks. I have loved ones, family members with mental illness, and I want everyone involved in any call for help involving the police to be safe. That includes police officers, but it certainly includes members of the public, especially those who are vulnerable. So, I joined the call for a swift investigation. We cannot wait, over a year for any sort of answer or response on this because the families are waiting. They have lost loved ones, and we owe it to them as parliamentarians and senators and people in, government positions to lend our voice to this cause. So, I'm here to just be a support and to join as well from coast to coast to coast in this fight to ensure that we have better safety protocols, ensure that, again, when a call is made for a wellness check, that all involved are going to end up safe and sound and where they need to be to have treatment responded in a proper way. So I'm available for questions as well, but certainly here as a New Brunswicker, as I mentioned, and as a support and, as a friend to the family. So I want answers just as much as they do.
So with that, I want to also say that I've been in touch with the family, of course, of Chantal Moore. I just want to read the names of the people that we've lost recently. Chantal Moore, Regis Korchinski-Paquette, Dondra Campbell, Ijaz Ahmed Chowdhury, and Rodney Levi. Rodney Levi, of course, was also an acquaintance of Jenica's because being both from New Brunswick, one of my best friends is the very close friend of Chantal Moore's mom. This is close, is personal, and we also need to say that the circumstances surrounding these deaths, as is noted in our press release, and it is the normal procedure for the province of New Brunswick to turn investigations over to the Sûreté de Québec Bureau d'enquête indépendante. But the Quebec BEI has said that they think they won't have answers for at least a year. The coroner's inquests are being postponed until we have answers from the BEI in Quebec. Chantal Moore's family is desperate for answers. Their daughter had no history of any reason that someone would call for a wellness check in terms of her conduct. They were concerned that there was someone who was bothering her. They still to this day don't know who made the 911 call. There are some very, very pressing questions that need answers. And as things now stand, the question of how it is that a 26-year-old mother, daughter, beautiful Indigenous woman was shot 5 times in her own apartment, those questions cry out for answers, and we hope that the Senate can get to these questions and provide answers. So with that, we're happy to take any questions you may have. We'll take a moment or two to move back and forth microphones. I also want to draw attention to anyone that in our press release issued today, it's a very strong statement from a member of the Indigenous caucus in the Canadian Senate, Senator Yvonne Boyer herself, Métis. So I draw your attention to that. Any questions?
So we'll now go to questions, starting with questions on the phone. A quick reminder, one question, one follow-up per reporter. Nous allons maintenant passer aux questions, en commençant par les questions au téléphone. Petit rappel que c'est une question suivie par journaliste. Operator, do we have a first question?
Thank you. Merci. Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. There will be a brief pause while the participant register for questions. The first question, la première question, is from Cormac McSweeney, City News. Please go ahead. Your line is open. Votre ligne est ouverte.
Yes, my question is for Ms. May, and I want to apologize. I know that this is an important topic that you're discussing today, but my two questions will not be on this issue. I am just asking about the economic snapshot coming out later today. I'm wondering what you're expecting, what you think about a budget deficit that could be in excess of $300 billion, and whether you're hoping to soon see sort of, I guess, for lack of a better term, an exit strategy, how the government plans to move away from this record spending and as we start to recover as an economy.
Thank you for the question, Cormac McSweeney. My expectations of the economic snapshot from Minister Morneau today are what we could have been expecting for some time now. I mean, we had a report from the Parliamentary Budget Office to the Finance Committee that the deficit would be on the order of at least $250 billion. If it's $300 billion, it's not a surprise. If Canada was spending like a drunken sailor for no particular reason, and we alone in the world had decided to spend more money than we spent for decades, I'd be alarmed. But we're in a pandemic. This spending is essential, and it's essential we keep spending. If we were to listen to the Conservatives and go into an austerity program right now, we'd plunge this country into a deep depression. I'm afraid that we have to look at the larger reality. Look at what central banks are doing all around the world. Bank of Canada is in lockstep with other banks around the world, slashing interest rates, increasing liquidity in the economy, buying billions and billions of dollars of bonds. As a matter of fact, the collectivity, according to the International Monetary Fund, their tally in April was that $6 trillion was added as liquidity into economies around the world by central banks around the world. So I look at where we are now, and according to the Parliamentary Budget Office, when we emerge from pandemic, which is a when, it really is an if, but as we get out of this, we know that we will not be in as severe a debt to GDP ratio as we were in the early 90s. So I'm hoping that in a sea of red ink, we can keep our wits about us and realize that if the government stops spending now, the economy will be worse off. What we have done is through spending, which I will remind everyone, the spending that was approved by the Government of Canada to deal with the pandemic was approved by unanimous consent. So the unanimous consent motions in later March, which are what funded CERB, what funded CEBA, all of the relief programs have emerged through, for the most part, unanimous consent motions. And I think the more that we keep partisanship out of this and realize that the only game in town for reopening our economy and kickstarting the economy is going to be the Government of Canada for some time. So I expect to see a snapshot. I'm interested to know what Mr. Morneau will share with us, but I think most of it is completely predictable, and I, for one, will not be calling for austerity.
And my follow-up question is about Andrew Scheer, and this is for a colleague of mine, but you had your own incident with the Conservative leader when you were unable to socially distance on a government plane when flying in for debates for the sitting of the House of Commons. Yesterday, the Conservative leader was photographed at Pearson Airport, not wearing a mask, having a conversation with Premier Brian Pallister, who later apologized for it. I'm just wondering what your reaction is to that when we see political leaders not to the T following the rules.
Well, I'm afraid my conclusion from Andrew Scheer's conduct is that he doesn't take COVID-19 seriously. I as you say, I had the experience and I regretted it. I had a lot of criticism from my own constituents that I agreed to be on a government plane where I knew that by accepting 7 members of the Scheer family on the flight that we would not be able to keep physical distance. But I must say that as I sat on that plane wearing my mask, I was shocked that Andrew Scheer and family got on the plane not wearing masks. So it's hard, and the other reality is, I was asked just moments ago unofficially by some media here in the room, what were we going to do about disability payments? What was going on with getting Parliament to sit? And the reality here is that on June 10th, people in the chamber were ready to pass a standalone piece of legislation to ensure that people with disabilities got their payments. We did not get that, and as today's press reports, it was the Conservatives said we would have agreed to it, but only when Parliament returns to full sitting. I've heard this from Conservatives in the chamber and in various committee hearings over the last few months, and I continue to be astonished that they don't seem to understand that it is not safe for 338 members of Parliament to attend as if things were normal. We could be vectors of disease to bring COVID-19 back to each and every one of our communities. It is not safe to have full Parliament sitting, and I've not heard Andrew Scheer once offer an alternative. They mock us when we say that they want us to return to full sitting. They say, we're not saying 338 MPs should sit. Well, then tell us what it is you are proposing, because I am sick to death of the Conservatives thinking that the pandemic is a non-excuse for Parliament being in the situation that we're in now. We are holding government to account through use of virtual sittings. We are holding government to account, but we can't pass legislation unless it's by unanimous consent. And both in the Senate, we talk about the Senate can't start its committee hearings into the wellness checks until September. Why is that? Well, that's because of Conservatives in the Senate. We can't pass legislation in Parliament. Why? Well, that's because the Conservatives will not allow distance voting, which is what is already happening in the legislature of British Columbia. So Mr. Scheer not wearing a mask in the Pearson airport is part of a piece. From beginning to end, this man does not seem to understand that we are in a public health crisis, and he is not helping.
Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Once again, please press *1 on your telephone keypad if you have a question. De nouveau, n'hésitez pas à appuyer sur étoile 1 si vous avez toute question. There are no questions registered at this time. Back over to the floor.
We'll now take questions from the room. Nous allons maintenant prendre des questions dans la salle.
Thought there was 2 microphones. I'm just wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on what role you think the federal government has here. Of course, a lot of these deaths, as you were saying, the investigations lie with the provincial governments and with the local police forces. So what role does the federal government play here, and how likely is it that the Senate or the House of Commons is going to be able to get those answers any faster than any of the local police forces or governments?
Well, to answer the second part of your question first, it is entirely likely that we could get answers faster because we've been told that in the killings of Rodney Levi and Chantal Moore, the earliest anyone could expect answers is a full year as the BEI in Quebec does the investigation. The role for the federal government is twofold. Some of these deaths are happening at the hands of the RCMP. There's a clear role here for the federal government. Rodney Levi was killed by an RCMP officer. Chantal Moore was killed by a member of the Edmundston Police. What all of these killings have in common that we've mentioned this morning and in our release, the two things that Chantal Moore, Regis Korchinski-Paquette, Dondra Campbell, Ijaz Ahmed Chowdhury, and Rodney Levi have in common. They were all killed on so-called wellness checks, and they are all either Indigenous, Black, or people of color. I would extend my concern and condolences, by the way, to the Trudeau family and to our Governor General that there was an attempt on their life, and we note that attempt led to, and that was a criminal act with intention to kill, and that ended peacefully. These individuals were shot dead, either fell off the balcony, or however that occurred, we don't know, in the course of a wellness check with no suggestion whatsoever that any of these the victims were breaking the law. So the role of the federal government is twofold. As a number of these killings involve Indigenous people, there's a role for the Minister for Indigenous Services to step up. There's a role for the Minister for Public Safety to step up because these killings also involve the RCMP. Clearly, there's a role nationally to look at mental health issues, and in a time that the world is roiled by the question of George Floyd's death and the question of how law enforcement relates to people of color and indigenous peoples and so on, there's a role for the federal government. Systemic racism requires, I think, a federal response. But again, the wellness check question, which would be the focus of this inquiry, is very focused on the specific question of, is it appropriate to have armed law enforcement respond to a quote unquote wellness check? Are there better answers? And for the families of the immediately bereaved in this terrible last month, we could get to some answers very quickly.
And
Do you want to speak to? Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to do a quick follow-up, but
Okay.
go ahead.
I'll go to Kim. You have to come to the microphone, Senator Pate.
It's no accident that we know, and I think that Yvonne Boyer has, in her comment in the press release, has drawn attention to the fact that we have the missing and murdered Indigenous women calls for justice. Chantal Moore was actually killed on the anniversary of the tabling of that report. And that makes many recommendations, as has the Mental Health Commission, as did the Kirby report of the Senate, as has the Hyde report in Nova Scotia. And so there are many ideas already of what can be done. Elizabeth was just speaking earlier about the deficit and the issues that are being raised. We know from the parliamentary budget officer, for instance, if investments had been made in things like a guaranteed livable income before this pandemic, we would have lower costs. If we had implemented many of the recommendations that have been put forth for decades in this country as a result of the shootings, the chokings, the otherwise deaths of individuals in prisons and on the street as a result of mental health issues, we wouldn't be in this situation, I would suggest. And so we're talking about an issue that also predates the criminal legal system, that actually starts with the child welfare, the education, and the health systems. Thank you.
My follow-up is about the fiscal snapshot that we're getting. You mentioned that the federal government is going to be the way that Canada is able to really restart the economy and kickstart it, and the answer is going to be the federal government. So I'm wondering, what do you see the federal government's role is as we start to kind of restart the economy, and how much emphasis or focus should they have on programs like the CERB and support for people who are unable to work? What do you see as their role basically moving forward?
Yeah, and again, I want to put this in the context of how the world, how governments around the world are responding to this crisis. If we look at the overall drop in GDP as a result of coronavirus, it's about 3 percentage points less than it would have been if we hadn't had the spending. So the spending was not, I don't know how to describe it except for other than essential. It was essential that we had programs that ensured that people could pay for their groceries and their rent and stay home. Flattening the curve meant that people couldn't be afraid that by following public health advice, they would not be able to feed their children, pay their rent, make their mortgage payments. And still people are falling between the cracks. So I go to Senator Pate's point as well. Yesterday, the Parliamentary Budget Office released a very important report, and there will be follow-up work because there are a lot of savings from a guaranteed livable income that the PBO wasn't able to take into account. But I think we do need to look at whether it's more effective and lower cost to move to guaranteed livable income. It's certainly the case that the around the world, certainly the European Union, many governments around the world are already announcing that their post-pandemic economic stimulus will be tied to ensuring climate action. We are at a very dangerous point globally where we are far too close to tipping points, which will ensure that there's nothing humanity can do in another decade to undo the damage we've done in the next 6 months. And then that's to say that we could put ourselves on a path of self-accelerating, unstoppable global warming that it spells the end of human civilization before the end of this century. So the economic costs, the costs and tolls in terms of human life increase. I think globally, and we've as Greens, we've called this a hinge moment in history. It's the kind of major moment, the sort of experience, and as the Parliamentary Budget Office has said, this is comparable not to the 2008 financial crisis. This is comparable to the spending in the Second World War. This is comparable to emerging from the Second World War, where world governments examined our institutions. And they did so at the famous Bretton Woods conference. We think it's time to think about a second Bretton Woods conference, to actually look at post-pandemic. Canada's going to be okay. there's no question in my mind. We had the fiscal firepower going into this. We're a strong, industrialized, wealthy, developed country. But the cost in human lives of post-pandemic famine globally could be hundreds of millions of human lives. We need to have the kind of conversation among world governments to say, let's look at whether we should not, as a matter of economic health, forgive the developing country debt load so that they can deal with food security and increase the amount of money that globally is provided to the World Food Organization, to the UN Food Agency, to make sure people get the basic amount of nutrition required to avoid starvation. We're looking at a global problem that will require more global solutions. And I would also say that I think I've asked Tiff Macklem this when we were in Finance Committee. Looking at modern monetary theory is important right now. We have bond rating agencies, and I think the bond rating decision of Fitch isn't worth the paper it was written on, because these bond rating agencies need real regulation. They were largely responsible for the economic crisis of 2008. They walked away from the mistakes they made there. I think it's time to really have a bigger conversation around whether the structures that were put in place at the end of the Second World War, almost a century, not quite a century ago, but certainly 80 years ago, aren't we ready to say what kind of structures? We invent our economy. We invent the rules and regulations around economic activity. We can't invent the rules of physics. We can't change atmospheric chemistry except by moving away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. There are things governments can do collectively to be more robust in our recovery in the global economy from COVID-19.
I will check one more time. Do we have any question queued up on the phone, operator?
Thank you. Once again, please press star 1 on the telephone keypad if you have a question. De nouveau, n'hésitez pas à appuyer sur étoile 1 pour toute question. There are no questions registered at this time. Back over to you.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference.
Merci tout le monde. Miigwech. Thank you.